The cold iron of the survey marker bit into Silas Blackwood's palm. He stood on the ridge overlooking his family's land in the Aspen Creek Valley. His goal was simple: to present the deed in his pocket and reclaim the cabin his father built. But smoke curled from the chimney, a clear sign someone else now called it home. If he could not secure his claim before the first snow, he would face the winter with nothing but the clothes on his back. He shifted the weight of his pack, the worn leather straps groaning in the quiet air. The valley spread below him like a rumpled canvas, painted in the deep golds and tired greens of late autumn. The creek, a silver ribbon, wound its way through meadows that were already brittle with the coming frost. He knew every turn of that water, every stand of aspen that trembled in the wind. He had spent the first 15 years of his life learning the language of this place, and the last 10 years trying to forget it. The war, then the silver mines, had taken him far away, but the pull of this land had been a constant, quiet hum beneath the noise of the world. Now the hum had brought him back. The cabin looked small from this height, but solid. The stone chimney his father had set with his own hands still stood straight and true. Someone had patched the roof with fresh cedar shakes, a lighter shade of brown against the weathered gray of the old ones. A small vegetable garden, mostly harvested, sat neat and tidy beside the cabin, its fences mended. These were not the signs of squatters passing through. These were the signs of people building a life. Silas took a long, slow breath, the sharp pine scent filling his lungs. His plan had been straightforward: walk to the cabin, knock on the door, present the papers, and politely explain the situation. But the sight of that smoke, a thin, peaceful plume against the vast blue sky, changed everything. It was a declaration of presence, a sign of family and warmth that complicated the simple lines on his map. He descended the ridge slowly, his boots sinking into the soft pine needles that carpeted the forest floor. He did not make for the cabin directly. Instead, he followed the game trail that ran parallel to the creek, keeping to the cover of the trees. He needed to see who was there, to understand what he was walking into. He found a spot behind a thicket of wild hawthorn, its red berries like drops of blood against the fading leaves. From here, he could see the front of the cabin clearly. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, was splitting kindling by the woodpile. He worked with a steady, practiced rhythm, his small axe rising and falling with a determination that spoke of long practice. He was thin but sturdy, his face serious with concentration. A woman emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on an apron. She was tall and slender, her brown hair pulled back from a face that was both tired and strong. She said something to the boy, and he looked up and smiled. It was a genuine, unguarded smile, and it struck Silas with an unexpected force. That was the moment his simple plan truly shattered. This was not just a piece of land with a structure on it. It was their home. Anyone listening can feel the weight of a choice that has not yet been made. His father's deed was in his pocket, the paper soft and worn at the creases, carrying the official stamp of the territorial office from 20 years prior. It was his legal right, his only inheritance. But the law felt distant and hollow compared to the quiet, living scene before him. He could not simply walk up and shatter their world. Not like this. He backed away from the hawthorn thicket, his mind racing. He needed a different approach. He needed information. He would circle around and approach from the main path, not as a claimant, but as a traveler. A man simply passing through, looking for a place to rest his feet. He would learn their story before he revealed his own. The decision settled in him, heavy but necessary. He would not begin his return home by destroying someone else's. The sun was warm on his back as he walked, but a cold knot of uncertainty had settled deep in his gut. He followed the creek until it met the wagon path that led to the cabin. His steps were measured, deliberately slow. He had faced down armed men in dusty mining camps and endured the frozen misery of a high-country winter, but his heart hammered against his ribs now. He rounded the last bend and the cabin came into full view. The boy stopped his chopping, his head snapping up, axe held ready at his side. The woman appeared in the doorway again, this time without the apron. A rifle rested in the crook of her arm, held loosely but with an unmistakable familiarity. Silas stopped a good 30 yards away, raising one hand, palm open and empty. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out, his voice feeling rough and unused. "Just passing through. I was wondering if I might trouble you for a drink of water from your well." The woman did not move. Her eyes, the color of moss in the deep woods, studied him with a quiet intensity. She took in his worn clothes, his dusty pack, the weary set of his shoulders. The boy stood frozen, watching his mother for a cue. "You're a long way from town," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily in the still air. "And this path doesn't lead much of anywhere." "I'm heading up to the North Ridges," Silas lied, the words feeling clumsy on his tongue. "Heard there might be some trapping work before the snows settle in for good." It was a plausible enough story. The high country was full of men like him, chasing rumors and seasons. She considered this for a long moment. Then, with a slight nod, she leaned the rifle against the doorframe. "Ben," she said, her gaze still on Silas. "Fetch the man some water." The boy, Ben, hesitated for a second before setting down his axe and running to the well. He worked the handle with practiced ease, the creak and rattle of the chain echoing in the quiet yard. He brought the water back in a tin dipper, holding it out to Silas without a word. The water was cold and clean, tasting of stone and earth. It was the same water he had drunk as a boy. "Thank you," Silas said, handing the dipper back to Ben. He looked at the woman. "My name is Silas." "Elara Vance," she replied, "and this is my son Ben." There it was, a name for the life that stood in his way. They were the Vances. He noticed the careful repairs on the porch steps, the way the axe handles were stored neatly, protected from the weather. These were people who cared for the place. "My husband Thomas built most of this up," Elara said, as if reading his thoughts. "He passed 2 winters ago. We've been managing on our own since." Silas nodded, a pang of sympathy cutting through his own tangled purpose. He knew what it meant to lose family. He knew the silence that followed. He saw a section of the pasture fence that was sagging, held together with twine. "Looks like you could use a hand with that fence," he offered, pointing with his chin. "I've got an hour or 2 of daylight. I'd be willing to mend it for you in exchange for a hot meal." Elara's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion returning. A stranger's kindness was a rare and often costly thing in these parts. But she also looked at the fence, and he could see the weariness in her face. It was one more task on a list that was likely endless. The town ledger would show her name, Elara Vance, paying for supplies, a record of her solitary struggle. A small twist of fate had put them both here, tied to the same patch of dirt by history and hardship. "I have tools," he added quickly. "I won't be a bother." She looked at Ben, who was watching Silas with wide, curious eyes. Then she looked back at Silas. "All right," she said finally. "A hot meal for a mended fence. Seems a fair trade." He had bought himself a little more time. But as he walked toward the broken fence, he felt less like a claimant and more like a trespasser. He set to work, his hands moving with the easy familiarity of tasks learned in childhood. He found the post hole digger leaning against the small barn, right where his father used to keep it. The worn hickory handle felt like an old friend in his grip. He dug new holes, his muscles quickly finding their old rhythm, the sharp scent of turned earth filling the air. Ben came over to watch, keeping a careful distance at first. He held a small carved wooden bird in his hand, turning it over and over. "My pa taught me how to set a post," Silas said, not looking at the boy. "He said you got to set it deep and true so it can stand against the wind and the weight of the snow." "My pa was a good carpenter," Ben offered quietly. "He made all the shelves inside, and my bed." "A good skill to have," Silas agreed, tamping the earth around the base of a new post. "A man who can build things can always make a way for himself." They worked in a comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds the thud of the tamper and the distant call of a jay. Silas could feel Elara's eyes on him from the cabin window, a watchful presence. He was under scrutiny, and he knew it. As he worked his way along the fence line, his boot struck something hard just beneath the sod. He knelt and dug around it with his hands, pulling away the grass and soil. It was a flat, gray stone, half buried in the earth. A deep B was chiseled into its surface. Blackwood. It was one of his father's boundary markers. He ran his thumb over the rough letter, a wave of memory washing over him. He remembered his father setting this very stone, telling him that a man's name on a piece of paper was one thing, but a mark on the land itself was another. It was a promise. This marker was physical proof, a receipt from the past that this was his land. Yet seeing it now, while mending a fence for the woman who believed it was hers, felt like a betrayal. He quickly covered the stone again, pushing the dirt and sod back into place. Anyone who has held a secret knows the sudden weight of it. The stone was his evidence, but revealing it now would feel like a weapon. He had come here with a clear title and a simple goal. Now he had a buried stone and a deeply complicated problem. He finished the fence just as the sun began to dip below the western ridge, setting the sky ablaze with orange and purple. The air grew colder, carrying the sharp promise of a frost-filled night. Ben had stayed with him the whole time, eventually helping by fetching tools and holding posts steady. The boy's initial shyness had given way to a quiet curiosity. Ilara called them in for supper. The inside of the cabin was clean and spare, but filled with a sense of warmth. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the air smelled of stew and fresh bread. The shelves Ben had mentioned were filled with preserved goods in glass jars, a colorful testament to a summer of hard work. Silas felt a lump form in his throat. This was not just a cabin, it was a home, filled with the echoes of a life he knew nothing about. He had expected to feel a sense of homecoming, but instead he felt like an intruder at their table. The past and the present were at war inside him, and he did not know which side to take. Supper was a quiet affair. The stew was rich with venison and root vegetables, and the bread was warm and dense. Silas ate slowly, savoring the first real meal he had eaten in days. Ilara and Ben ate with the unhurried pace of people accustomed to each other's company. The silence was not awkward, but filled with the small sounds of living, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the crackle of the fire. "The fence is solid," Ilara said, breaking the silence. "It will hold through the winter." "Thank you." "It was my pleasure," Silas replied, and he was surprised to find that it was true. The simple, honest labor had felt good. It had grounded him in a way he had not felt in years. "Where are you headed from here, Silas?" she asked, her gaze direct. "You said the North Ridges." "That's the plan," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Going to check my trap lines before the heavy snows hit." It was a flimsy story, and he suspected she could see right through it. Women who survived alone in these mountains learned to read men like they read the weather, spotting the signs of an approaching storm. "There is not much trapping left in those ridges," she said quietly. "The big companies cleared them out a few years back." Her words hung in the air, a gentle challenge. He knew she was right. His lie was fraying at the edges. Before he could respond, Ben spoke up. "Are you a hunter?" "Sometimes," Silas said, turning to the boy. "When I need to be." "My pa was a great hunter," Ben said, his eyes bright with memory. "He could track a deer for a whole day and never lose the trail. He taught me how to read the signs." He pulled the small wooden bird from his pocket and set it on the table. "He carved this for me. It's a mountain bluebird." The carving was simple but elegant, the lines smooth and full of life. It had clearly been made by a loving hand. Ilara reached out and touched the carving gently. "Thomas could make wood sing," she whispered, more to herself than to Silas. "He made this from an aspen in the grove just behind the barn." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. The grove behind the barn. His father had planted that grove, a line of saplings he had carried down from the high country himself, a gift for Silas's mother. Each tree represented a promise for their future. Now a piece of one of those trees sat on the table between them, a symbol of another family's life, another family's promises. He had to get out. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt suffocating. "I should be going," he said, pushing his chair back. I need to make camp before it gets fully dark." "You can't," Ben said quickly. "A storm's coming. Mama said she could smell it on the wind." Silas looked at Ilara, who nodded. "The boy's right. The wind shifted an hour ago. It will be a cold one. You can sleep in the barn. It's dry and there's plenty of hay." He wanted to refuse, to put distance between himself and this place that was twisting his purpose into knots. But the thought of a cold night under the stars with a storm brewing was not appealing, and some part of him was not ready to leave. "I'd be grateful," he said, his voice low. The truth was becoming a heavier burden with every passing moment. He had come to claim a piece of property, and now he found himself tangled in the lives of its inhabitants. The barn was filled with the sweet, dusty scent of hay and the warm animal smell of a single milk cow. Ilara gave him 2 thick wool blankets, her movements efficient and distant. The brief warmth that had been at the dinner table was gone. replaced by a careful reserve. She was kind, but she was not foolish. A stranger was still a stranger. Silas found a spot in the hayloft, the blankets a welcome barrier against the growing chill. Through a gap in the barn boards, he could see the light in the cabin window, a small, defiant yellow square against the immense darkness of the valley. The wind began to pick up, whistling through the cracks in the old wood, carrying the first sharp flakes of snow. He lay back in the hay, the weight of his father's deed a hard rectangle against his ribs. He thought of the stone marker with the B for Blackwood and the wooden bluebird carved from a Blackwood tree. Everything here was a mix of his past and their present. To claim one, he would have to erase the other. He knew what he had to do. Tomorrow he would go into the town of Aspen Creek. He would visit the land registrar's office. He had to see the official records for himself. There had to be an explanation, a mistake in the paperwork that could resolve this without confrontation. The town land deed for this valley carries an old territorial stamp, a detail he remembered his father pointing out with pride. He would look for that stamp on the Vance's claim. He needed facts, not feelings. The storm arrived in earnest around midnight. The wind howled and snow lashed against the barn, a furious white assault. Inside his nest of hay, Silas was warm and dry. He thought of Ilara and Ben in the cabin, safe by their fire. He was an outsider, sheltered by their grace while holding the power to turn them out into a storm far worse than this one. He drifted into an uneasy sleep, his dreams a jumble of his father's face and Ben's smile, of legal documents and carved birds. He woke once in the deep of the night. The storm had quieted to a steady, whispering snowfall. The world outside was utterly silent, blanketed in white. In that profound quiet, a new and troubling thought took root in his mind. What if there was no mistake? What if his father, in the years after Silas had left, had sold the land? What if his deed was nothing more than a memory, a piece of paper with no legal power? The possibility was a cold shock, more chilling than the winter air. If that were true, he was not a claimant. He was just a drifter, lying to a widow and her son. The thought kept him awake until the first pale light of dawn. The world was transformed. A thick blanket of snow covered everything, softening the hard edges of the valley and muffling all sound. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and the air was so cold it stung his lungs. When he entered the cabin, a fresh pot of coffee was brewing on the stove, its rich aroma a welcome comfort. Ilara and Ben were already awake, moving with the quiet efficiency of a morning routine perfected by practice. "The storm passed quicker than I thought," Ilara said, handing him a steaming mug of coffee. "But the snow will stay. Winter's come early this year." "It seems so," Silas said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. His resolve from the night before felt solid in the clear morning light. "I need to head into town today. I was hoping you could point me the right way." "Town is a half-day's walk, longer in this snow," she said, her expression unreadable. "What business do you have in Aspen Creek?" "Supplies," he said, the lie tasting stale. "And I need to check in at the registrar's office about a land claim." He watched her face carefully as he said the words. A flicker of something crossed her features, too quick to name. Was it fear? Recognition? "The registrar is Mr. Croft," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "His office is next to the mercantile." She gave him clear directions, her words precise and detached. The warmth of the previous day was gone completely, replaced by a brittle courtesy. He knew she suspected something. Ben was quiet, watching the exchange with a child's intuition, sensing the unspoken tension in the room. Silas thanked her for the shelter and the food, the words feeling inadequate. As he was about to leave, he turned back. "Your husband," he began, then hesitated. "When he filed his claim on this land, did he mention anyone else ever living here?" Ilara stiffened. "He bought the land fair and square from the land office. It was listed as abandoned, unclaimed for more than 5 years." Her voice was sharp, defensive. "The paperwork is all in order. We pay the taxes every year." The crate in the corner of the cabin, used for storing potatoes, bore a mine mark from the North Star operation, the same company his father had sold timber rights to. It was a small detail, but it was another thread connecting their lives. "I see," Silas said quietly. "Thank you again." He left the cabin, the crunch of his boots in the fresh snow sounding unnaturally loud. The valley was beautiful in its new white coat, but it felt colder and more alien than it had the day before. The walk to town was arduous. The snow was deeper than it looked, and the cold was relentless. By the time he saw the first buildings of Aspen Creek, the sun was high in the sky. The town was a small, rugged collection of log and clapboard buildings, lining a single muddy street, now covered in snow. Smoke rose from every chimney, the only sign of life. The land registrar's office was a small, cramped room smelling of dust, dry ink, and stale tobacco. A pot-bellied stove in the corner fought a losing battle against the cold. A small, balding man with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from a massive ledger as Silas entered. "Help you?" the man asked, his voice thin and reedy. "I'm here to inquire about a parcel of land," Silas said, stamping the snow from his boots. "Up in the North Valley, the old Blackwood homestead." The man, Mr. Croft, peered at him over his spectacles. "Blackwood," he repeated, running a finger down a page in his ledger. "That claim went fallow years ago, lapsed. It was acquired by a Thomas Vance 6 years back. His widow holds the title now." His words were casual, matter of fact, but something was wrong. "My father, Jedediah Blackwood, never sold that land," Silas stated, keeping his voice even. "I have the original deed right here." He pulled the worn document from his coat and laid it on the counter. Croft barely glanced at it. "An old deed means nothing if the taxes weren't paid. The territory reclaims the land and resells it. It's all perfectly legal." "I want to see the record of sale to Thomas Vance," Silas insisted, "and the record showing the Blackwood claim lapsed." Croft sighed, a sound of profound irritation. He pulled another, newer ledger from a shelf behind him. He opened it, his finger tracing a line. The Trading Post ledger from last winter shows Alara Vance trading furs for flour and seed, a clear record of her working the land. But this official book was different. "Here it is," Croft said, turning the ledger for Silas to see. "Vance Thomas, paid in full. Title issued, sealed and certified." Silas looked at the entry. It looked official. The signature was firm, the entry neat. But the seal, the official stamp of the territorial office, it looked too new. The ink was too sharp, the impression too clean compared to the faded, slightly blurred seal on his own deed. It felt wrong. It was a small detail, a tiny inconsistency. But in his gut, Silas knew it was the key. He had his proof. The question now was what to do with it. Silas left the registrar's office with a cold certainty settling in his stomach. The seal was wrong. It was a forgery, or at least a newer stamp used to make a recent transaction look old. Mr. Croft was either a party to a fraud or incredibly incompetent. Silas suspected the former. He stood in the snowy street, the chill seeping into his bones. He needed more than a gut feeling. He needed someone who knew the old ways, someone who remembered his father. He needed Elias Thorne. Elias was a trapper and prospector who had been in these mountains since they were just lines on a map in some faraway office. He had been his father's closest friend. If anyone knew the truth of what happened to the Blackwood land, it would be him. He found Elias in the town's only saloon, a smoky, low-ceilinged room filled with the smell of wet wool and cheap whiskey. Elias was in a corner booth, nursing a drink, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his beard shot through with gray. He looked up as Silas approached, his pale blue eyes sharp and intelligent. "Silas Blackwood," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I'll be. I heard you were dead." "Not yet," Silas said, pulling up a chair. "I need to ask you something, Elias, about my father's land." He laid out the story, keeping his voice low. He told him about the Vances, about Croft, about the deed with the wrong seal. Elias listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving Silas's face. When Silas was finished, Elias took a long drink from his glass. "Your father never would have sold that land," Elias said with absolute certainty. "That place was his heart. He sold some timber rights to the North Star Mining Company a few years before he passed. They logged the East Ridge, but he was clear, timber only. The land was for you, for when you came home. This was it, the missing piece, the North Star mine, the crate in Alara's cabin." "Croft told me the claim lapsed," Silas said. "Said the taxes went unpaid." Elias snorted. "Jedediah Blackwood paid his taxes every year. He'd come to town, We'd have a drink. He'd go to the mercantile, then Croft's office. Like clockwork. The Trading Post ledger shows 3 names from last winter who paid their taxes in furs. Your father always paid in coin. He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. Croft is a snake. Always has been. Came here with empty pockets, and now he owns half the businesses on this street. A man doesn't get rich that fast by being honest. So Croft had lied. He had likely used the timber sale as a pretext to declare the land abandoned, then sold it to an unsuspecting Thomas Vance, pocketing the money himself. He had created a false deed to cover his tracks. It was a simple, ugly crime. Anyone listening in the quiet knows the click of truth falling into place. What do I do, Elias? Silas asked. He felt a surge of anger, hot and clean, but it was followed by a wave of weariness. This was no longer just about his land. It was about Alara and Ben, who were innocent victims in Croft's scheme. You got your deed, Elias said. You got my word. But that's not enough against a man like Croft. He's got the town council in his pocket. You need more. You need undeniable proof. He tapped his temple. Thomas Vance worked for the North Star before he bought that land. He was their foreman. I reckon he paid Croft with company scrip, or maybe a bank draft from the mine's account. The pieces were all there. The mine, the timber rights, Thomas Vance's employment. They were all connected. The old mine office is abandoned now, Elias continued, but they might have left the records behind. If you could find a payment record from Thomas Vance to the town, one that doesn't match Croft's ledger, you'd have him. The path was clear now, but it was dangerous. It meant breaking into the old mine office. It meant directly challenging the most powerful man in town. But for the first time since he'd arrived in the valley, Silas knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't just fighting for his land anymore. He was fighting for the Vances too. Silas spent the rest of the day gathering what he needed. He bought a pry bar and a lantern at the mercantile, paying with the last of his silver. The storekeeper, a man with nervous eyes who seemed to be a cousin of Croft's, watched him with suspicion. The whole town felt closed off, its loyalties already drawn. As dust settled, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gray, Silas made his way to the abandoned North Star mine office. It was a bleak, skeletal structure at the edge of town, its windows boarded up, its porch sagging. The wind moaned through the gaps in the siding, a lonely, mournful sound. He worked the pry bar under a boarded-up window at the back of the building. The wood groaned in protest, then splintered with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silent evening. He froze, listening, but the town was quiet. He slipped through the opening into the pitch-black interior. The air inside was frigid and smelled of mold and decaying paper. He lit the lantern, its yellow glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. The office was a chaotic mess. Papers were strewn everywhere. Furniture was overturned, and a thick layer of dust and grime covered everything. It looked as though someone had left in a great hurry. He started his search with the main desk, its drawers hanging open. He sifted through piles of old invoices, shipping manifests, and payroll ledgers. The records were a chaotic history of the mine's life and death. He found lists of names, records of accidents, and desperate letters from suppliers who had not been paid. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the room feel alive with ghosts. After what felt like hours, his fingers numb with cold, he found it. Tucked away in a small, locked cash box he had to force open was a separate ledger. It was a private account book, kept by the mine superintendent, and in it, under a date from 6 years ago, was a single damning entry. T. Vance final severance pay, transferred directly to Aspen Creek Land Office, account of H. Croft, for purchase of lapsed Blackwood parcel. It was all there. The amount, the date, the purpose. It was not a payment from Thomas Vance. It was his final pay from the mine, redirected by Croft himself. Croft had not sold the land to Vance. He had stolen Vance's wages and given him a fraudulent deed in exchange. The land deed in Alara's possession carries an old stamp, a forgery meant to hide this very transaction. This receipt, this ledger entry, was the truth. He carefully tore the page from the ledger, folded it, and placed it in his inside pocket. As he did, he heard a sound outside, the crunch of boots on snow. He immediately doused the lantern, plunging the room back into darkness. His heart hammered in his chest. He moved silently to the broken window, peering through a crack in the boards. Two men stood outside, their forms dark silhouettes against the snow. One was Mr. Croft, the other was the town sheriff, a large, heavy-set man named Brody. "I told you we should have burned everything," Croft hissed, his voice a nervous whisper. "Someone was asking about the Blackwood place today." "Calm down, Henry." Sheriff Brody's voice was a low rumble. "No one's been in this office for years. It's just the wind." They stood there for a long moment, listening. Silas held his breath, every muscle tensed. Finally, they turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the night. Silas waited until he was sure they were gone before letting out a slow, shaky breath. He had the proof he needed, but now Croft knew someone was digging into his past. The game had just become infinitely more dangerous. Silas did not go back to the Vance homestead. It was the first place Croft and the sheriff would look for him. Instead, he went to the one other person he could trust. He found Elias Thorne's small, isolated cabin tucked deep in the woods, miles from town. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney, a welcome sight in the cold, moonlit forest. Elias opened the door before he even knocked, a rifle in his hands. He lowered it when he saw Silas. "Figured you might be stopping by," he said, stepping aside to let him in. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Silas said, slumping into a chair by the fire. "I saw the truth." He showed Elias the ledger page. The old trapper read it carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. He let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "The snake. He didn't just steal your land. He stole that poor man's wages." The full weight of Croft's crime settled on Silas. He had not just cheated one family, he had cheated two. He had used one man's death and another man's absence to enrich himself. "What now?" Silas asked. "I can't just walk into the sheriff's office. Brody was with Croft tonight. He's in on it." "Brody's not a bad man," Elias said thoughtfully, "but he's a lazy one, and he likes a quiet life. Croft keeps things quiet. Brody won't cross him unless he has no other choice." Elias stood and began to pace the small cabin. "You can't do this alone, boy. Croft has the law and the money on his side. We need the people." "The people in town?" Silas scoffed. "They all seem to be related to him or scared of him." "Not all of them," Elias said. "There are good folk in Aspen Creek, people who remember your father, people who have been squeezed by Croft themselves. But they won't speak up for a stranger. They need a reason." He stopped pacing and looked at Silas. "They need to see the truth for themselves, and they need to hear it from the person who has the most to lose." "Alara Vance," Silas said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "She has to be the one to present this. It's her husband who was robbed. It's her home that's built on a lie." The plan was risky. It meant putting Alara and Ben in direct conflict with Croft. But Elias was right. Her voice would carry more weight than his. She was a part of the community, a widow raising her son alone. Her story would resonate in a way his never could. "How do I get to her?" Silas asked. "Croft will be watching her place." "We'll go at dawn," Elias said. "He'll be expecting you to run. He won't be expecting you to run straight back into the heart of the problem." As the fire crackled, Elias shared more stories of Croft's dealings. A rancher who lost his water rights under suspicious circumstances. A prospector whose claim was invalidated on a technicality, only for Croft's nephew to refile on it a week later. The Trading Post ledger shows 3 names from last winter who bartered with Elias for credit against Croft's high prices. A pattern of quiet, legalistic theft emerged. The ledger page in Silas's pocket was not just about his land. It was about justice for the whole valley. The first hint of dawn was a pale gray line on the horizon when Silas and Elias set out. They traveled through the trees, avoiding the main paths, their movements silent and swift in the deep snow. Elias moved through the forest with the easy grace of an animal, and Silas followed in his footsteps. They approached the homestead from the ridge behind, the same way Silas had first arrived. The cabin was quiet, a plume of smoke already rising from the chimney. Alara was an early riser. They waited until they saw her come out to milk the cow. Elias gave a low whistle, the call of a mountain quail. It was a signal he and Silas's father had used for years. Alara froze, her head snapping up. She scanned the trees, her hand instinctively going to the small pistol she wore at her belt. Silas stepped out from behind a large pine, his hands raised and empty. Her eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with suspicion and fear. "Stay back," she warned, her voice tight. "I don't want any trouble." "We're not here to cause trouble, ma'am," Elias said, stepping out beside Silas. "We're here to stop it." Silas walked forward slowly, stopping a dozen feet from her. He looked her in the eye, wanting her to see the sincerity in his face. "My name is Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice clear and steady in the cold morning air. "Jedediah Blackwood was my father. This land is my inheritance. But more importantly, Mr. Croft is a thief, and he stole from your husband." He held out the folded ledger page. "This is the proof." The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the gentle lowing of the cow and the distant cry of a hawk. Ilara stared at the paper, then at his face, her own a mask of confusion and disbelief. Her entire world was resting on this single piece of paper. Ilara did not take the paper at first. She looked from Silas's earnest face to Elias Thorne's weathered, steady one. She knew Elias by reputation, a man as honest and unyielding as the mountains themselves. His presence gave weight to Silas's incredible claim. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Thomas bought this land. I saw the deed myself." "The deed was a lie," Silas said gently. "Croft created it to cover his tracks. He took your husband's final pay from the mine and told him it was the price of the land. But the land was never his to sell. He just pocketed the money." He laid the ledger page on the top rail of the fence. "This proves it. It's the mine superintendent's private log. It shows the money transferred directly to Croft's account." She picked up the paper, her hands trembling slightly. She read the entry, her eyes tracing the faded ink. The details were all there, cold and irrefutable. The name, the amount, the date. She sank onto a nearby stump, the paper clutched in her hand. The foundations of her life, the home she had fought so hard to maintain for her son, had crumbled to dust in a matter of moments. "So this," she said, gesturing to the cabin, the barn, the fences. "None of it is mine." "The cabin is yours," Silas said firmly. "Your husband's labor, your work. You paid for that 100 times over. What isn't yours is the lie you were forced to live under. What isn't Croft's is the right to steal from people." Ben came out of the cabin then, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He saw his mother's distress and ran to her side. "What's wrong, Mama?" "Nothing, honey," she said, pulling him close. "We're just talking." She looked up at Silas, a new fire in her eyes, the fire of a mother defending her child's future. "What do we do?" It was we. In that single word, everything changed. They were no longer adversaries. They were allies. "We show this to the town and on," Leah said, "but we do it right. We need to choose our moment." The plan they formed was simple and bold. The town council held a monthly meeting in the community hall. The next one was tomorrow evening. It was a public meeting, and most of the town attended, especially with winter setting in. It would be the perfect place to confront Croft, in front of everyone he had built his reputation on. There was no back room for him to hide in, no chance for private threats. He would have to answer for his actions in the court of public opinion. Anyone listening can feel the quiet resolve that settles when a decision is made. "He will deny it," Ilara said, her voice stronger now. "He will say the paper's a forgery." "That's why you have to be the one to speak," Silas said. "You're one of them. They know you. They know your struggle. And you'll have this." He pulled his father's deed from his pocket and handed it to her. "Look at the seal. Compare it to the one on your deed, the one Croft gave you." The land deed carries an old stamp, faded and authentic. Hers, she now realized, was too sharp, too perfect. "And I will be there," Elias added. "I will tell them about your father paying his taxes, about the timber sale. I will vouch for you both." The three of them stood in the cold morning air, a small, unlikely alliance against a powerful man. They were bound together by a single piece of paper and a shared desire for the truth. For the rest of the day, they prepared. Silas and Elias stayed hidden in the woods, while Ilara went about her day as normally as possible, not wanting to arouse suspicion. But a new energy coursed through the small homestead. It was the energy of a coming storm, of a truth that had been buried for too long and was finally about to see the light of day. The community hall was packed. The warmth of so many bodies combined with the heat from a large cast iron stove made the room feel close and stuffy. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and melting snow. The entire town of Aspen Creek seemed to be there, their faces illuminated by the flickering yellow light of kerosene lanterns. Mr. Croft sat at a table at the front of the room, flanked by Sheriff Brody and the other two members of the town council. He was leading the meeting. His voice droned on about the need to clear the main road after the recent snowfall. Silas and Elias stood at the back of the room, their hats pulled low. Ilara sat near the front with Ben, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked pale but determined. Silas watched her, his respect for her growing with every passing second. She was about to risk everything, her home, her safety, on the word of a stranger. Finally, Croft finished his report. "Is there any other business to come before the council?" he asked, already beginning to gather his papers, eager to end the meeting. This was the moment. Ilara stood up. Her movement was so sudden that a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to her. "I have business, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice shaking slightly but carrying to every corner of the hall. Croft looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Mrs. Vance, what is it?" "It's about my land," she said, stepping forward. "The land my husband bought 6 years ago." She held up the 2 deeds, one in each hand. "You told my husband he was buying the lapsed Blackwood homestead. You gave him this deed." She held up the newer document. "But this," she held up the other, "is the original deed. It belongs to Silas Blackwood, Jedediah Blackwood's son. The claim never lapsed." A murmur went through the crowd. Names were whispered. Blackwood, Vance, Croft. The registrar's face had gone rigid, his eyes like chips of ice. "That is a ridiculous accusation," he said, his voice cold. "The records are perfectly clear. The Blackwood claim was abandoned." "Then explain this," Ilara said, her voice growing stronger, fueled by the truth. She held up the ledger page. "This is from the North Star Mines private accounts. It shows my husband's final wages being paid directly to you, Mr. Croft, for the purchase of this land. You didn't sell him land. You stole his wages and gave him a piece of worthless, forged paper in return." The room erupted. Shouts and accusations flew from every direction. Croft was on his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is slander. That document is a forgery. Sheriff, arrest this woman." Sheriff Brody rose slowly to his feet, his face troubled. He looked at Ilara, then at Croft. His hand rested on his pistol. "Hold on, Henry," a voice boomed from the back of the room. Elias Thorne pushed his way to the front. The crowd parted for him. "I can attest that Jedediah Blackwood paid his taxes on that land every year until he died. I was with him. I also know he never sold that land, only some timber rights." Another man stood up, a rancher with a weathered face. "Croft did the same to me with my water rights. Told me a claim had lapsed when it hadn't." A third person, a woman near the front, spoke up. "He foreclosed on my brother's store with papers that never looked right." The accusations snowballed, a dam of long-held grievances bursting forth. The people were finding their voice, united by a shared sense of injustice. Silas stepped forward then, standing beside Ilara. "I am Silas Blackwood," he said simply. The crowd quieted, their attention fixed on him. "All we are asking for is the truth. Let the council examine the documents. Compare the seals. Look at the evidence." Sheriff Brody looked at the angry faces of his neighbors. He looked at the 2 deeds in Ilara's hands, and he looked at the beads of sweat on Henry Croft's forehead. He was a lazy man who liked a quiet life, but he was not a corrupt one. He knew which way the wind was blowing. He turned to Croft. "Henry," he said, his voice heavy with resignation, "I think you have some explaining to do." The power had shifted. It was no longer in the hands of one man, but in the hands of the community. The truth, once revealed, had a weight and force all its own. The meeting lasted late into the night. One by one, people came forward, their stories weaving a damning tapestry of Henry Croft's greed. The town council, under the weight of overwhelming evidence and public pressure, had no choice. They examined the deeds, noting the clear difference in the seals. They looked at the mine ledger, its stark entry a silent witness. By the time the moon was high in the sky, Henry Croft's reign over Aspen Creek was over. Sheriff Brody placed him under arrest, not for the theft from the Vances and the Blackwoods, but for a dozen other crimes that had surfaced over the course of the evening, the town, it seemed, was cleaning house. In the aftermath, as the crowd dispersed into the cold, snowy night, Silas and Alara stood outside the community hall. The air was clean and sharp, and the stars were brilliant in the black sky. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "The land is legally yours," Silas said. "My deed is the valid one." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the snow-covered street. She did not look at him. Ben stood beside her, holding her hand, his small face filled with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "But a deed is just a piece of paper," Silas continued. "A home is built with work and with love. You and your husband built a home on that land. My father built a cabin. Both are true." He looked at her then, at her strong, tired face. "I've been gone a long time. The valley is not just a memory to me anymore. It's a place with new stories. Your story." He took a breath. "I propose a partnership. The land is big enough for all of us. We can work it together. I have my father's name. You have your husband's legacy. We can honor both." Alara finally looked at him, her eyes shining in the lantern light. A slow smile spread across her face. "A partnership," she repeated. "I think Thomas would have liked that. And I think your father would have too." They walked back to the homestead together, the three of them, their path illuminated by a single lantern. The snow crunched under their boots, a peaceful rhythmic sound. The cabin waited for them in the distance, its windows glowing with a warm, welcoming light. It was no longer his or hers, it was theirs. The valley was quiet, resting under its blanket of white. A new chapter was beginning for the old Blackwood homestead, a story not of a single claimant, but of a shared future. Winter had come to the mountains, but in the small cabin in Aspen Creek Valley, a new warmth was taking root, strong enough to withstand the coldest of seasons.